All right, my name is Matt Enns, and this is the first ever show of the SovMan Podcast. And today I have the honor of hosting a true pioneer in the realm of men's work and personal transformation, somebody that I feel so honored to be speaking with. And that is Douglas Gillette, an author, speaker, psychotherapist, and probably best known as the co-creator alongside Robert Moore of King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, rediscovering the archetypes of the mature masculine. And that's a groundbreaking book. It's profoundly influenced men around the world, and it provides a timeless framework for understanding masculine psychology and personal growth. So, with decades of experience exploring mythology, psychology, and spirituality, Douglas has helped illuminate the path for men seeking to live with purpose, authenticity, and maturity. His insights into archetypal energies and the transformative power of initiation continue to shape the conversation about what it means to be a man in the modern world. And in this episode, we're going to dive into the masculine archetypes, the critical need for an initiation in men's lives, the future of men's work, and also his new and forthcoming book, Soulmaking, the realization of the mystical life. Welcome to the first ever episode of the SovMan Podcast, and it's absolutely a privilege and an honor for me to have you here.
Thank you very much, Matt. It's great. This is the first one, so this is great. This is inaugural.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, I have a fairly active social media presence, but it wasn't until Drew encouraged me. He said, "We better get a podcast going." I said, "Well, if I can have Douglas on my show, that would be an honor." So,
it's an honor for me too.
Thank you. Thank you. So, maybe a good place to start would be just a quick run through of the masculine archetypes and what that means in the context of today's world. I would imagine you're going to do a better job of that than I would. So,
according to Robert and me, there are four. I mean, there's more, but there are four foundational archetypes to masculinity. In its many forms, and that is the king, the warrior, the magician, and the lover. And we discovered, I think those names resonate. I mean, I think every man knows what that is, initially, which is why I think the book has been so helpful. Because you get it right away. Oh, yeah, I do express these things. This is part of my vision of masculinity. When I started working with Robert, how many years ago? 3,466 years ago, whatever it was. I'll never forget, we were sitting in a cafe in Hyde Park neighborhood in Chicago. And we were going over conceptualizing stuff, and Robert had named the four archetypes by then. He'd been teaching that for a while, and he had hinted around in his teaching at shadow forms of the archetypes. And I had studied that material. So we're sitting there in the cafe, and I said, "You know what, Robert? I think these shadows are bipolar in the sense that one side is aggressive and the other side of the shadow is passive." And wow, there was just stunned silence as we realized we'd just gotten through to another level on this. And he immediately drew a triangle on a sheet of paper that we had there, and archetype in its fullness at the top, and then the bipolar shadows, which I went back and brainstormed and named and so forth. So now we had a map. Now we had a map that wasn't just about aspiration. Oh, I want to be able to express the king more fully. We had a map that described, I think, where, with the shadows included, the shadow sides, that men could feel the truth of that too in their lives. While, yeah, I'd like to express the king, but I'm being cut off by this, that, or the other thing from feeling that. And the key is, okay, you're caught in one or the other, or you're going back and forth between the Shadow King in the Tyrant form, Shadow King in the Abdicating King form, etc. So, yeah, we evolved this map and then started working to see how the ego, the person we normally think of as us, which doesn't include much of us actually, how it could start working with, identify and then work with its shadow aspects, to A, get a clearer read on oneself, and B, begin to sort of ascend the center of the triangle, you might say. Oh, another thing, with the 4 archetypes with bipolar shadows, we realized, just for the sake of paradigms, models, whatever, that you could put the 4 sides together and there's a pyramid, you know. And so men have a map to begin moving into their fullness. A word about archetypes in the fullness form and in the shadow forms. You should not want to be an archetype, because archetypes are powerful personish energies, structures that if you that should be in dialogue with the ego. The ego must stay in charge, you know, integrating this stuff. You can see men who historically and even in the present who seem to have become possessed. And that's what archetypes will do, because if you get too close to them or you start identifying with them, you are certifiably insane.
And it also seems like there's an inevitable fall. The example of Conor McGregor. Are you familiar with Conor McGregor, the fighter?
I'm not sure. No.
So he was this cultural phenomenon who kind of made the UFC the biggest fighting league,
Oh.
kind of on the radar in a new way. He was winning every fight, and initially you could sense this excitement, and he was kind of, you know, bad mouthing, bad talking the other athletes that he was fighting against. But then you saw this switch sort of take place in him where instead of channeling the energy of the king or pursuing it, he became possessed by it and saw himself as unbeatable. And then inevitably his life has essentially fallen apart since then. I mean, he's still doing very well, very wealthy, etc. But there's this very unhealthy energy, and his fighting career's kind of fallen off. And that was, I think, a really huge example of this kind of identifying as the king rather than structuring that energy.
Yeah, it's all over the place. I mean, in government, international relations, and in our work situations, in entertainment, where men will project the idealized archetype out onto somebody else, an entertainer, performer, whatever, and it does you no good if you're projecting it out there on a charismatic figure of any kind. You have to hold it within. You have to withdraw the projection and hold it within and work with it. Here's something that's because possession is exactly what the word describes. And more likely than not, if you become possessed, you almost by definition fall into one or both of the shadow forms. So that men that become possessed by the king, by definition, fall into the tyrant, the aggressive or active pole of the shadow. Men who become possessed by the king if they have a somewhat different temperament, more probably less extroverted, more introverted, generally will fall into the passive pole, the abdicating king. And that's easy to do too. It's just say, okay, I have no responsibility for this, Okay, so you're a CEO, let's say, and you get pushed or you get shoved and you fall into the passive pole. You can say, I don't want to give examples, personal examples, but from the news and so forth and people I've known. But the abdicator says, oh, I didn't have any role in that. I didn't have any responsibility for that. And you see that on the news, which I watch a lot less of now, but it is so painful and so awful, most of it for me. But how many times do you see somebody interviewed, usually a man, could be a woman, and they just abdicate? They just say, oh, that's not my responsibility. I didn't know about that. No, I'm not identified with that. And it's like, okay, so now where do we go? We don't have a leader.
Well, maybe I can ask a question on that specifically because, there's this tendency to project the ideal king. Donald Trump is probably a good example because he's this cultural phenomenon that I haven't seen in my lifetime where people project the king onto him or they project the tyrant king onto him. But what I see in a broader sense is because we don't have a clear structuring or any presence of the mature king in the individuals of a society, we don't recognize what the mature king looks like in leaders. And so we get all these kind of abdicating kings, these weak kings, these passive kings who we don't even, if a reporter, for example, asks a question of a prime minister or a president anywhere in the West, why didn't this go well? It doesn't even cross our minds that his answer would be, oh, well, I made a mistake, because his answer would be, here's why it went well, and it's not my fault. And that's just normal now.
Yeah, that's part of what I'm alluding to is on the political scene. It can also be on the personal scene in our families and so forth too, and other organizations. But yeah, I mean, how tired are we? I am of dodging questions and not answering the question, never taking responsibility. And that partly also gets into the shadow magician, because the shadow magician in its active shadow side is a manipulator. It's and that's why there's a lot more to the human psyche than the ego. There's all this stuff underneath, informed by the archetypes into our personal unconsciouses, that is manipulating, and then not either not being conscious that you're doing it, or if you are conscious, being a jerk about it by not owning it. So I mean, unfortunately, as I look around the world, as I always have, I see failed initiation all over the place.
Yeah, so that's something I was really excited to talk to you about, because there's a bit of a problem today where, and maybe you can speak to this, where, I mean, one of the ways you can sum up all of the political, economic, cultural, societal problems we have is that we have a bunch of uninitiated men.
Right. We're run by our society, and maybe it's increasingly, it is increasingly, but also in a certain sense, it's always been this way, but it's like more intense now or something. We're not being governed by men. We're being governed by boys. See, that's another thing that happens if you if there isn't some serious mechanism for becoming initiated into manhood. And that means taking responsibility for yourself and how you, boys don't do that. They can't. They're too unconscious. They're developmentally, they're not at the point where they can. So I think you can't really begin to take responsibility for your life and your effect on others and beginning the journey of initiation, at least in Western societies, until you're probably 35, 40, late youth, early middle age. You've got enough mileage on you by then and so forth to yeah, okay, I kind of get the lay of the land. But without elders, as traditional peoples call them, to help a man, a boy trying to become a man, become initiated into generative manhood, you could call it, or mature manhood. Geez, I mean, where do you go? You're stuck, and you need a wise elder who has traveled a similar path and himself been initiated. Where are those people? I mean, they're here and there and so forth, but and I would say too that your initiator, the elder, needs to also be, and maybe not in every case, but generally needs to have a fair amount of psychological knowledge, training, and been through that route. As I sometimes joke with my classes and my book discussion group now on Zoom, it's kind of a joke, but it's not. 100% of human beings need to be in therapy, and 95% of them need to be taking psychotropic medication. And I almost mean that, really. It's certainly true for men, but women too, in a slightly different tonal whole or venue. They need initiation too, and to mature. And maturity is always, I mean, it always involves firmness with compassion, tenderness, etc., caring. If you see somebody who is man or woman who is compassionate and caring and empathic, but doesn't have firmness and structure, in the end, they just become Pollyanna-ish and naive, and generally speaking, cannot do a lot of good. On the other hand, if you see people, men or women, we're talking about men, who are so firm, their boundaries are so rigid, they're so structured that there's no give, there's no elasticity, there's no I talk about hard-edged and soft-edged. Hard-edged, you're headed for the tyrant. Soft, but you don't have to go to the passive pole to be soft-edged. Know who you are, as far as that's possible, and let your boundary be firm, but not a brick wall. Let it fuzz a little and accept, as far as it's possible to do, the other. It's a tricky business. Human beings are, from an evolutionary psychology point of view, human beings are extraordinarily and dangerously complex chimpanzees.
Yes. I've got 15 questions based on what you just said, so permit me to wander around here
Yeah,
while I
yeah,
find the specific one. But
yeah.
you're mentioning how we don't have proper initiation processes, and so we have a lot of these paraturnists, these, boys forever, essentially.
Right.
And one of the difficulties that I look at when I see modern society is an initiation ritual should be connected to your community and to your shared beliefs and to the symbols and stories of your past. And we specifically, I'm in Texas now, but I grew up in Canada. And in Canada specifically, we don't want a shared story, right?
Mm,
We want a cultural mosaic. And
mhm,
it
mhm.
makes the work of modern initiation very difficult. So the way that I've approached it in my men's programs, um, I started trying to solve these problems by getting involved in the political process and in other things. And I realized that the solution is not going to be found there. It's at the individual level. But then I would work with these men, and what I realized is their lives, I was working with executives initially, and their lives were going fairly well. And so there was no sacred or liminal space opening us up to do the deeper work. And now my main coaching program is I work with men whose wives are leaving them to see if they can
Mm,
save the marriage. And so it opens up this space for initiation that wouldn't
yeah,
otherwise exist. And so as we have this absence of initiation, how can we initiate enough men that
yeah,
initiation becomes more normal, and then something maybe more organic emerges from a group
yeah,
of
yeah.
initiated men?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great question. That's a complex question. I'll try to answer a couple of things from my perspective, of course. Um, First of all, rituals of initiation originated, as everything else human did, in uh, in groups of 25, 50, maybe 100 people. So we're not in that situation anymore. You know, the tribal groups were about that size. They eventually got larger. We are now in mass societies, massive social configurations. And when you're talking about the fragmentation or the multiplicity of these different cultural spheres, venues, environments, they are not, as I think we can see in the United States today. I don't know about Canada, but they are not cohesive. They just keep breaking into all kinds of different parts. So what is it we're being initiated into? Initiations were always about becoming initiated into uh, manhood, let's say mature masculinity, as the tribe of 25, 50, 100 people, half of them men, defined their culture, their belief system, their way of doing things. It was always being initiated into the society. Well, if you have a fragmented society that is billions of people, it's difficult to see how initiate the initiations that do exist are still into small groups. And I'm thinking of everything from maybe Greenpeace to Proud Boys, and everything in between. You're being initiated into a particular self-defined but present culture that is exclusive of others. The exclusivity is traditionally and in traditional societies is necessary for the definition of what a man is in that society. See what I mean? The exclusivity is an inherent part of that. Okay, so if we do that now in the United States, for example, of 420 million people, half of them men. If we try that, there is, politicians talk about unifying the country. There is no way to do that except by force, and that's a false unity. That's what dictators and strongmen always think they can do, is create unity by force. Well, you may get conformity to a very large extent, but you won't get unity, and you won't get empathic understanding of the other at all. So we do have a problem. How do you become? And then there are idealists who want to go further. I used to be one of these that I thought it could be done. It can't be done. Become initiated into humankind. All 8 billion of us. So there is a real problem, as you're pointing out. And so what Robert and I mostly thought, because you can be initiated into the Mankind Project, and there were other men's groups and still are. And there's this manosphere thing, which is not a coherent whole at all. A convenient term for this and that and the other thing. But Robert and I said, the task of initiating in a coherent way into a worldview that everyone agrees on, not possible. So we're inevitably either going to be initiated into tribal groupings that are exclusive of other tribal groupings, which I don't think of as a good thing, or the route we decided to pursue, become initiated from boyhood into manhood individually in your sense of identity. So it's a psychological rather than a social thing.
There's this idea in with one spiritual teacher, and he's speaking more of a spiritual religious process of, rather than joining a church, which was what we've done for a very, very long time, you take the modern path of individual spiritual initiation.
Yeah.
So sort of this almost this self-guided journey. Is that sort of what you're speaking to, that men have to seek out this individual path of initiation?
I am. I don't mean to exclude the value of community at all, because we are who we are because of those we interact with, and partly, and they are who they are because of us. So there's community. There needs to be community in which values are shared and challenged and so forth. So that doesn't go away. We can't all become hermits, nor should we, perhaps. But yeah, I am talking about individual by individual. I've given up the idea. There's so many things here. There's a commonality in my view of what it means to be authentically human, as the Neo-Confucianists talked about it, the authentic human being. There is such a thing, in my view. So there is a universality in which we are all each other at a deep level. But as we live our daily lives in specific contexts, that is a psychological experience we can have. But when you try to explicate it and make it applicable to here and now, it's not going to happen. So yeah, it is individual. And I think of, I don't want to get religious here because I don't know what your audience is, but I'll say that one of Jesus' probably authentic sayings is, we enter the kingdom of heaven through the narrow gate.
Mhm.
That means one at a time. That's how narrow that gate is. I've seen the narrow gate
Ah,
in the walls of Jerusalem. You got to squeeze through.
this is
Uh,
the eye of the needle.
yeah, it's a similar image. Eye of the needle makes it virtually impossible, but the narrow to do that to reach the kingdom of heaven. But the narrow gate, it's possible but hard. And he finishes by saying, "The masses take the broad road to destruction."
Mhm.
I used to think that he was in a bad mood when he said that, or was being arrogant, or maybe both. I now think that was the truth 2,000 years ago. It's true now, and I can't foresee a time when it won't be true.
Mhm.
So yeah, it's that narrow gate thing that is the path of initiation for each one of us, one at a time.
Mhm. So it's almost this idea of kind of merging the old idea of a community-based initiatory process with the hero's journey.
It
And
is, yeah. It's great that you brought up the hero's journey too, because as Robert and I say, the hero is the last most powerful archetype of boyhood
Mhm.
at its best. When the hero is slain or attacked by demonic forces and so forth, uh, what is he reborn as? He's reborn or rises from boyhood into mature masculinity. Yeah, yeah. A lot of guys think they should be heroes, uh, and I do think optimally that gets fulfilled in some major way in our lives.
Mhm.
I wanted to be a hero for my wife and then my daughter and my granddaughter, and that heroic thing is still there, with me. Um, but the hero realizes, I think, the tipping point or the pivot, as they say now. The hero realizes he has to die to romantic notions of that. The hero will not conquer evil, darkness, the world, his own life. So he has to say, oh, okay, I'm done for. That's it. For me, it was useful in boyhood, you know, but now I'm moving into a different stage of life. I have to. I'm being pressed through the narrow gate. And what's on the other side? Ideally, uh, elders, wise men, etc., who can say, "Welcome. Okay, let's get to work."
And that does seem to be the process, and that's something that I really work on with my clients because and partly it's because I don't find that there is a group belonging that all of them share.
Yeah,
They tend to on average more be Christian than Muslim, but there's both of them, right? And they tend to on average be, from the West, but they're not necessarily from the West, right? So
mm-hmm.
the way that I've tried to solve that is basically giving them a process that they can utilize to find their own path.
Mm-hmm.
And wherever that takes them, they're going to meet mentors, they're going to meet elders along the way. But the focus needs to be not in joining another kingdom, but in kind of looking at yourself as the king of your own kingdom and saying, well, what is my kingdom? Maybe my kingdom is my bedroom in an apartment I share with four roommates, or maybe it's myself, my children, my wife, and my business, whatever it might be.
Right.
But if you look at it that way, things tend to sort themselves out well. And what I like about your process that I think is maybe absent in a lot of therapy, there's that famous quote from Carl Jung, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you'll call it fate.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And your framework makes the unconscious of men much more conscious and makes it something we
Yeah.
can begin to work with, which is why I rely on it a lot with my clients. But do you think that there is an issue with therapy? This is certainly the way that I see it, where therapy is more or less effective, depending on the individual, obviously, at addressing some pathologies you might have or some past traumas, but it doesn't necessarily give you a structure that can guide you towards your, your capital P path.
Right. No, I agree with that. I don't mean to be disrespectful, but I think a lot of therapeutic approaches and schools of psychology are superficial and not that they're not helpful up to a certain point, but it's more like a band-aid, band-aid psychology. Once you've realized that, once I realized that I am present in some form at a whole series of registers, I call them, or levels or layers, then it's not just about important to work with the personal unconscious. Absolutely. And equally important to move from that into the depths, of the soul, of the psyche, and the heights. I mean, yeah, so things probably need to be taken step by step. You don't start with this expanded notion of yourself, or it will be inflated. You start with the personal and make as much of the personal unconscious conscious as you can be, as you can do it, and trying to integrate as much of your personal shadow fragments, materials, personish entities, really, some of them, so because they carry strengths as well, and they get malicious and destructive when they're not paid attention to.
Yeah, I use the analogy, if you keep your shadow locked up in a cage, like, it's going to get out at some point, and when it does, it's going to be really hungry, and it's going to take a bite of whatever's closest by.
Right, and I think that I look at this last election in the United States as the return of the repressed. I would wince sometimes watching. I mean, I'm basically a progressive, okay, in most things, but social and political and environmental, etc. But I recognized years ago that some of the media that I was getting from that side of things, it seemed a little over the top, and some of the arrangements schools and businesses and other things were making, and just even the ads on television and so forth, it was like, we're losing something here that we need to include. Races, peoples, etc. And so I know there was still is a drive to push forward on what I would call progressive social and political programs in the environment and so on, which I'm for. But if you do that, if the price for doing that, at least at the speed with which it's been done, is to repress whole groups of people, classifications of work types and so forth, and deny any kind of validation to understandably and probably correctly viewed as more rigid or enclosed or exclusivistic world. I mean, I agree. It is hard to include those who don't want to be included. But the result is, though, if you are misrepresenting human beings on the as liberal, progressive, etc., when half of them aren't, that's the repressed or oppressed, even in socioeconomic terms. And there is going to be a revolt. Yeah, that's it's classic Jungianism.
Mhm.
It really is.
So I don't know if I even have a question fully formed here, but there seems to be some kind of analogy where you're like, okay, we're going to include all of the potential of this side, but we're going to ignore all of the structure of this side,
Hmm.
right? So it's kind of this like seeking unbounded potentiality without recognizing the need for structure. And it almost draws a parallel. I have no idea if I'm gonna, eat my own words here in some way, but the trans phenomenon is something that's really, really fascinating from a psychological perspective. And you don't, your books that I've read in depth were largely written before this, but you
Hmm.
you did in The King Within perhaps talk about trying to contain kind of the infinite possibilities of the archetypal energies within the ego structure itself. I think the line was something like, when you try to, you're pursuing this kind of androgyny on a psychological level, it's like this
Hmm.
masturbatory narcissistic stance is, I believe, the term, where you're like, I'm going to hold all of the potential of this, but
Yeah,
in
that's
the
great.
ego.
Yeah, if we said that, that was grandiose.
Okay.
Because again, while we are all each other ultimately, in my view, because we're all human and we're all connected by, I think we live, move, and have our being within a psychic medium.
Mhm.
Jung would call the collective unconscious, I would call it the collective consciousness, because the unconscious is not unconscious of us. It's we who are unconscious of it.
Love that.
So, and so, but as it's, I mean, I hate to use a cliche, but the Hindu thing about we're the caps on the waves of an infinite ocean. There is this whole mystery of how you go from oneness to multiplicity, what you gain, what you lose from that. Uh, and I think what you're talking about exactly that. Um, how do you how do you simultaneously recognize that we are all each other and individuate, as Jung calls it, become individuals, more structurally, dynamically aware of our individuality. Somehow, you know, for us who have the luxury to pursue that, um, that is en route to maturation and as the Neo-Confucianists say, the authentic human being. Right? I have to recognize that most men, most women aren't anywhere near being in a social, economic, or any other situation in which they have the luxury to pursue the inner journey. Um, and that is truly tragic for, in my view, for humankind. Um, let's get let's get back to what was your other point in there?
Well, I guess there's this, you were mentioning kind of this push towards maybe progressivism too fast. And part of progressivism is like potential,
Oh,
right?
the potential. Yeah.
And then with the
Hmm.
trans phenomenon, it's like I'm going to hold all of that potential
Oh,
inside of
okay.
the
Okay.
ego. And I just love to kind of hear you unpack that because it's
Okay.
something we don't understand as a society yet. I think we can say that with
Yeah.
certainty.
The On the one hand, the ego is the only place in the psyche that we, as we are aware of anything. That which is not entered ego consciousness, we're not aware of. That which has, we become aware of. It may slip out too. The That whole business of, yeah, I don't believe the human ideal as we are as individuals is androgyny.
Mhm.
And if it were, I mean, just from a pragmatic standpoint, nature would abandon us and find some other creature that wanted to reproduce,
Mhm.
and made that its top priority. That's nature's top priority,
Mhm.
is practical immortality. Not that androgynous people can't experience, you know, and I'm sure they do, uh, the urge to reproduce and to have children. I know many do, and they find ways of doing that. But I don't believe that the human uh, drive in this world, anyway, as this world is set up, is to reach the state of androgyny, which for Jung, when you've done all the work that you can do, he imagined stasis in the psyche. Nothing more to strive for, nothing more to do, nothing more to, it's just balanced and static. And I take it that androgyny can, doesn't always, but can head that direction. So what do we do if we're masculine, feminine in equal parts, or even have those meshed, and have done all of our other psychological work, and now we have stasis? So what do we do with that? Nothing, because in stasis there is nothing to do. But I Drew and I are working on conceiving
Mhm.
and outlining a new book beyond
Very
soul
exciting.
making. Yeah, that attempts to be a little more, a lot more maybe nuanced, and include more than the books that Robert and I did, about the masculine, but also the feminine, and also alternative genders or alternative gender identifications. I realized that from an archetypal psychological point of view, those other, uh, and there's many actually, almost individualized, not quite, but approaches to within the LGBTQ plus community to worldview, view of self, etc. So, but we're going to try to offer something for traditional men, traditional women, and alternative gender or gender identifications. I know it's a minefield because people, the 8% or whatever that has alternative gender feelings and expressions and identities, is understandably very sensitive about what words are used. And there are arguments within the gay community, about what words to use to describe who they are, and so forth. So I know it's going to be a minefield, but
Oh yeah.
oh yeah, but it's something. And also, Robert and I, in our work for men, did not do much with including the anima, the
Mhm.
feminine side of all men. I mean,
Mhm.
there's wide variation and so forth about how much of that, the feminine, is included, how much of it is integrated, integratable, and so forth. But there again, Jung's goal was not, at least in practical terms, was not androgyny. It was inclusion of the feminine element, which in most men, not all, is um, uh, a, it's not like it's 50%. It could be in some men. It could be more than 50% in certain males or men. Uh, but, so I'm working on that too.
Okay. So I've got a couple of different places we can go from there. So one of them is there's this attempt to find that balance inside of yourself, right? And maybe that balance is 50-50, maybe it's 80-20,
Yeah,
whatever.
whatever.
But in a relationship, you also have to find that balance, because if you're kind of
Mm,
in terms of your internal balance of masculinity and femininity, if you're a 50-50 person and you marry an 80-20 person, it's going to be an awkward relationship, right?
right.
And it
Yeah.
seems like culturally we've tried to kind of androgynize relationships for the last several decades. And what I've experienced in my program, which again is helping men to save marriages, is that one of the most helpful things you can do for these individuals is say, hey, look, here is what you can offer. Here are the gifts you can offer a relationship as the masculine half of the pole. And here's the gifts she can then offer the relationship as the feminine half of the pole. So giving them a structure at each end of the pole is
Hmm.
very psychologically stabilizing for them, because it kind of, especially for men, it goes, oh, now I know what to do.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
taking away that structure has left a lot of men very, very, very lost. And so
Hmm.
people can misinterpret this and say, oh, you want to go back to the 1950s. And I certainly don't.
Hmm.
But what I want to do is give people a framework, say, hey, here's traditionally the gifts the masculine can give the feminine and vice versa.
Right.
Now, figure out what works for you inside of
Yeah.
your relationship.
Yeah.
And
That I think that's great. You probably have never heard of it, and the publisher never promoted it. But many years ago, after the 5 books that Robert and I did a book on couples, for couples, based on evolutionary psychology.
oh,
Yeah, called Primal Love. You can still find it uh, on the
well,
internet.
I found all of these right here, which are the other four in the King Warrior Magician Lover series.
Okay.
These are the
It,
hardcovers.
yeah,
But they, yeah, you have to find them and you have to pay for them. So I'll look for that one. You
that
said
is true.
Primal Couples,
Primal Love.
Primal Love. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a little outdated in some respects, and it wasn't politically correct enough for the publisher, I think, was the problem. I mean, nobody came out and said that, but it died a sudden death uh, just as it was going to print. But uh, we there's nature and nurture, right? Uh, Nature is what we are inherently, what we're born with, uh, in temperament and intelligence and emotional intelligence, even to some great degree. And I think uh, gender, but not gender understood as biology or
Mhm.
as exactly mapping onto biology. But there's also nurture, the influence of early caregivers, the influence of society, school, et cetera, and then, in the formative years. The argument is always which is stronger,
Mm.
nature or nurture. And I argue in that ancient book, Primal Love, and continue to argue that based on my life experience anyway, nature is stronger.
Mhm.
It shouldn't be the absolute determiner, but it is stronger. You see that if you have kids and you have kids, same environment, same, you know, uh, but they have different temperaments and personalities, and that you can begin to see just even at birth.
Mhm.
And you didn't do that. You didn't shape them that way. That's how they brought that,
Mhm.
which I think is a combination of genetic makeup, and let me say, in ways that we do not understand
Mhm.
very, very well or very thoroughly. But I also think there are spiritual influences, the
Mhm.
influences of unincarnate entities
Mhm.
that from elsewhere, else when where kids come from,
Mhm.
and that that works with the DNA and so forth. Okay, so with the genes and so on, but we are, because we're so complex, our nearest relative, whom we behave a lot like, the chimpanzee.
My favorite book on psychology is Chimpanzee Politics by Franz de Waal,
Yeah,
which is not a book
mine
on
too.
psychology.
Mine
Yeah.
too. Take that and map it onto our political systems, and you've got a
Boom.
match.
Yes.
Yeah. But as individuals, there is enormously more plasticity. But the social engineers who tried to create the political correctness, for all their good intentions, were still either overtly or implicitly working from the we are tabulus rasas point of view. We can be anything, do anything.
We're blank slates.
We're blank slates, and upon which nurture will write who we are, who we become. Of course, there's some truth in the plasticity of the psyche, much more plastic than our beloved chimpanzee like common ancestor. But it has its limitations. It comes up against nature. And that's something we as society, as I'll just talk about the United States because that's what I know the best, doesn't get. I mean, some people get it, but they go too far with nature because men are generally bigger, upper body strength, et cetera, have testosterone going on, brains are wired a certain way. They have a right to be dominant. And by gosh, God told us that in the Bible. Adam was first and Eve was created as a second thought. I mean, where was the biology in that? Created as a second thought to be Adam's helpmeet. So she's in a one down position.
And she screwed it all up.
So there you have it. I'm not talking about empowering men to feel that or to buy that worldview, which after all is an Iron Age point of view. And at the same time, I can't sign on to the blank slate thing. That men and women are interchangeable parts. Some may be, but again, I think all populations are some form of bell curve, some form of, climax in the middle, and we overlap a lot. We are capable of overlapping a lot, the genders, but we're not the same thing. There are cases where we are with certain men and certain women, but in general, you can't just switch them out and have the same result.
Yes. So we're coming fairly close to your time limit here, and there's about 10 hours more I'd like to do. So I'll skip over some things just quickly. One of them I know from my conversations with Drew is you're working on this idea that essentially if you balance the archetypes, there's a new archetype that emerges. And that was very attractive to me because I worked with a mentor, a psychologist in Canada, Mariusz Zadrog, and he's working on an idea, I won't give it away here, but where he has 3 archetypes, and if you balance them, a 4th archetype emerges. And that was very attractive to me, that something new and different emerges, but we'll have to wait until after Soulmaking, which we're going to talk about, for that book to be available to the public. One question I want to ask you before we get into that as the final end here, because I think he's an interesting cultural phenomenon. But Jordan Peterson, and why I ask that is, there was Plato, and then let's just skip everybody else, and then there was Nietzsche, right? And then Jung kind of brought those back together in some sense and made it intelligible. And Jordan Peterson seems to be bringing back science and religion, relying largely on Jung, right? But it's this kind of thesis, antithesis, synthesis.
Right.
And
right.
Jordan Peterson has brought that to the public consciousness in a massive way. So I'd just quickly be interested in your thoughts on him as far as you're familiar.
I'm not that familiar. I mean, I've watched some of his YouTubes and so forth. And I think that just based on limited, experience of him, that how do I say this? I want to be polite. The more followers, general principle, the more followers a person has, the more dilute and misinterpretable the material they're presenting is. Also, when you're appealing to relatively vast numbers of people, you do have to dumb down or simplify, maybe oversimplify. And I think that Jordan Peterson is probably doing a great service in many respects. I know that he's using the 4 archetypes from time to time. I believe that insofar as it's possible to do, which isn't always possible, but one needs to cite and make explicit one's sources. Behavior of a charismatic figure that does not acknowledge sources, his or her sources, is manipulative. It's trickster magician, and it shows a lack of just respect. I mean, for example, with the example you gave of the bringing the 2 together into a higher third, the 3 together, that, yes, Jung made that a psychological, a feature of psychology. He got it from Hegel, and to some degree from Fichte. And they got it from earlier sources. You could even say middle or Neoplatonic sources. I think we should acknowledge, and that's my,
Can I read into that? Maybe this is completely off base, but Jordan Peterson is somewhat of like an alchemist hermeticist, and he's not actually admitting that because it's unpopular or because it would make him look bad. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
Yeah. That's my take on what limited exposure I've had to him, and I'm happy on the one hand that the 4 archetypes, as he sometimes says, and remember the 4 archetypes. Okay, I'm happy that is part of the culture now, and more, really. But I'm not happy that there isn't explicit recognition of where that idea comes from.
Okay. Yeah. No, I can see that for sure. That's but he is at least bringing back an interest in the archetypal landscape.
Yeah, he is, and he's doing it. Yeah, he is, and explicitly doing it, and probably more honestly than some other gurus.
Yeah, and I'd be curious actually. Have you seen what has happened to the sales of Magician King Warrior Lover the last 5 or 10 years?
The 4 books, you mean, or
no? Sorry,
the first one.
The first book.
Yeah, first book is
Have
sold.
the sales increased?
It has been solid and stable, but it recently in the last 2 years have been surging again.
Yeah, I bet that's not unrelated. That's interesting. Okay, well, I know you have to go soon, and I did want to talk about your book. I'm not sure if it has been released or it is.
It has been released.
Okay, it has been released.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about that, and yeah.
Yeah, that is Soulmaking. That's the publisher's title. I didn't experience myself as making a soul. I experienced it, it was not conscious or intentional. But what soul making is, I mean, on the one hand, different ways to talk about it. It is a lot of, not all of, but a lot of my experiences of psi phenomena at the sort of low end, I think, and spiritual phenomena, exaltation and feeling of near oneness and joy and gratitude and love. The story of a lot of that stuff through my life. And I present it as, okay, look, these things did happen. And some of them left and created physical effects.
Mm-hmm.
So it's important for our own understanding of ourselves as persons. And again, I lift up personhood as the highest value of reality, capital R. And as that toward which all of the rest of this stuff is while personish itself has been pointing. And as persons, the unarguably, I think, most fulfilling, most expansive, most whole feeling we can have is love. I mean, the study of asteroids is fascinating to some extent, but how does that compare with a baby's smile? You know what I mean?
Different categories.
Yep. Different registers of value.
Yes.
And so it's got, lyrical illuminations, lots of stories of psychological fact, and then my ruminations about those things. And the purpose or the goal really is just to share and inspire and encourage people to have more open hearts and minds toward themselves, others, and reality, capital R, not be locked in this modernity thing, which is a thin band width on the whole spectrum of reality, capital R. And that by doing that, we do become more authentic. We know more about ourselves, and can integrate that as far as it's possible. What it does for men, I think, is it allows a man to understand whatever his circumstances are, wherever he's at emotionally, intellectually, et cetera, socially, economically. He is not confined to this.
Mm-hmm.
That's liberating.
Mm-hmm.
To realize simultaneously with life here, we are also living elsewhere and elsewhen, and that's part of who we are too.
I need to connect you with my friend Drew Weatherhood, who has a fairly popular podcast, but he wrote a book called Layers of Truth. And
Oh,
I'm sure he would love to pick your brain on this because
yeah.
we've forgotten that mystical experience for essentially all of human history, except for the last blink of an eye, was considered more real than
Mm-hmm.
the things that you can empirically
Right.
verify, touch, smell, knock on wood.
Right.
And there seems to be this renewed or emerging awareness that, capital R reality is different than factual reality.
Yeah, it fully informs, I think, factual reality, and is present everywhere, all the time, right here with us right now. But reality, in my view, is layered. The layers, however, are leaky,
Mhm.
so that stuff leaks in, or maybe intentionally arrives, to inform us, guide us, etc. and um, and it's all valid, and it's all true, and it's all what it is intended to be. So I know that on the one hand, I can say that some of my, when I'm in an altered state, which I don't meditate to get into, it just sort of happens sometimes. Uh, and am feeling the indescribable rush, the thrill, unaided by drugs, by the way, of the wonder, the mystery, the vastness, the how much. Wow. I mean, I thought I thought I was pretty knowledgeable about a lot of things, and I am, but it's confined. There's so much more. And so when I'm in that state, I feel that, I mean, it just comes to me, that is more real than my daily life. On the other hand, what would anything be worth? I'm talking about from my perspective, obviously. What would anything be worth if it weren't for persons meeting and loving and accompanying each other through this narrow band? I mean, yeah, the expansive state is wonderful, maybe ultimately wonderful, but it's not more real than the explicit reality that it has created and manifested. It does it for a reason. And so that I don't think that it's an error, as many Buddhists talk about it. And I ask them, error, who or what made the error? I never get a straight answer. It's like, well, then I don't think it's an error. And I have experienced my own life is so filled with wonder and joy and pleasure, as well as the pain and so forth. But geez, I mean, and to make babies and raise kids, and then the next generation comes along, and there's this little human consciousness, newly experiencing. Yeah, I mean, geez. Do you really feel that is worthless or an error or less real than, the divine? I can't imagine that it is.
No, and I think one of the difficulties is we're so trained to think of belief as a purely intellectual process, and we're taught how to believe intellectually our whole lives, so that even if we have an experience that's counter to that, we don't accept that experience. And if you've had the experience of holding, your infant in your arms, that is infinitely more real than any intellectual belief you could possibly
Oh
come.
yeah, that is it, capital I. I mean,
Exactly.
and from a theological standpoint, I would even say that it's in moments like that with others, and maybe especially with babies, but I feel the same thing with my wife too and daughter, and a few others at times. But it's like that right there is an opening.
Yes.
It's the opening to all of that, and the vastness and wonder and gloriousness and so forth of all that is contained right there, looking into that other person's eyes and seeing the smile. I mean,
Yeah, a little microcosm of capital R reality, of eternity, of all of that.
yeah.
Well, that's a beautiful place to end. I will reluctantly respect your time. This has been an honor for me. Like I said initially, it's I'm not a guy who's particularly enthusiastic about meeting athletes or performers, and the vast majority of my heroes have been dead for centuries or even millennia.
Me
So
too. Me
yeah, so to
too.
be able to converse with you was very, very exciting for me. An unbelievable honor, and I'm really grateful for your time. And I'm really excited to read not only Soulmaking, which is out quite recently, But also Primal Love. I'm going to have to find a copy of that.
Yeah, as I say, it's a little dated, but a lot of what I say there, I really think is true.
Amazing.
So
Well, thank you again so much for your time, and I hope we get to do this again.
yeah, thank you, Matt. Me too. I had a great time. You're a
Thank you.
great host.
Well, first run, so we'll see if I can get better over time.
You're good. You're good now. You'll be, if you get better, you'll be, I don't know what's better than good. Fantastic. I don't know.
I'll take it.
Anyway, it's been a great pleasure. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
So we can, yeah. So I'll end the recording there. But yeah, just thank you. That was so much fun for me.
Was for me too. Yeah. I know we're skating on thin ice when we try to, as men, write about women's psychology.
Yeah.
But I mean, somebody needs to do it. I mean, Jean Shinoda Bolen did it in a way, Goddesses in Every Woman and things like that. And then she wrote Gods in Every Man. Okay, well, if you're, I mean,
Yeah.
and we are the same species, you know.
Yeah.
So it's not like writing about, as a man, writing about extraterrestrial psychology.
Yeah.
So I mean, I'm hopeful I can offer something really good there.
Well, I can appreciate that because I'm writing a book right now, and it's a very practical book, basically trying to help men understand women. So
Oh,
I'm
good.
putting into male language the process of feeling and
Hmm.
experiencing connection and relationship from how they experience fear differently than we do and everything. So I'm
Yeah.
sure I'll get slaughtered by a lot of people for it, but I think it's just so important. So
It's really important right now. I'm really thrilled that you're doing that. And I'm hopeful about Drew's and my
I can't wait to
upcoming
read
efforts.
that. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, people are so balkanized. They're so
Mhm.
polarized, not just poles, as in two poles, but
Balkanized.
balkanized,
Yeah.
fragmented, and understandably touchy and so forth about anyone other than them, or even
Mhm.
some in their own
Mhm.
group saying something that they feel doesn't apply to them. That
Mhm.
it is a minefield, and when you get into the alternative genders, or whatever you want to call them, identities, whatever, sometimes they don't even like that term. You're really in a minefield.
Yeah.
uh,
But
but
that's okay. That's
but
where all the fun is anyway.
yeah, that's okay, because um, trying to make a contribution to help us mesh better.
Yeah. Well, and it's better if one person with a dog and some curiosity wanders out into the minefield than all of society just walking across it at the same time.
That is true. That
Yeah.
is true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. All right.
Thank you again.
Thank you, Matt. And I know you're busy, and best luck with your book. And hopefully we can talk again sometime.
I would love that so much. Take care.
Blessings for your podcast.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Okay.
Catch you
Bye-bye.
later.